Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, this is the Inept General, and welcome to our Let's Talk video on Legendary Lord starting positions for Total War Warhammer 2. Now, this video is going to focus primarily on the starting positions for Legendary Lords in Total War Warhammer 2 Mortal Empires campaign, which is the merger of the campaigns of Total War Warhammer 1 and Total War Warhammer 2 put together. Now, this is perhaps maybe the second video in an unofficial series looking at some tweaks that can be made to the Mortal Empires campaign to make it really the fully realized version of Warhammer universe in sort of the Total War format. The first of these is our look at storytelling within the Mortal Empires campaign and how that can be improved with so many stories to tell in the Warhammer world, just looking at different ways that Creative Assembly might address that. If you're interested in seeing that video, do check out the top right hand corner of your screens now, or you'll find the link in the description below. Now, this is because the Mortal Empires campaign is going to be our prize at the end of the rainbow when the third Total War game is released. This is it, and I think there are some touches that need to be addressed to really make it that full and the best experience it can be for the players who have stayed with the series throughout all three games and probably getting a lot of DLC on the way as well. So, for the majority of this video, because Total War Warhammer 2 is a relatively new game, Creative Assembly, the makers of the game, have kind of come to some decisions on how they want to play out where you start different campaigns by moving the faction Legendary Lords apart from one another, and now no two Legendary Lords in Warhammer 2 start in the same place. This was not the case, however, for Total War Warhammer 1. As such, I have little reason to believe that in this upcoming update in May, that we may see any changes to the Total War Warhammer 2 races. So in this video, we're going to look at potential changes that could be made to the races of Total War Warhammer 1 to give us more varied campaigns with them within the aspect of Mortal Empires itself. Now, that's not to say that the races of Total War Warhammer 2 don't have problems on the Mortal Empires campaign. They do. For example, myself, I personally really dislike Kroq-Gar's starting position. He doesn't even really get a chance to get his claws into a lot of the Chaos guys, depending on obviously how your campaign goes. Also, it's very hard to confederate with any of your Skaven Legendary Lords, and you likely only have to play one at a time, because they're almost literally at this point spread out to the four corners of the world on the campaign map, and so very hard to get together. Now, I'm not saying those don't need addressing, they probably do at some point, but for the purposes of this video, we're just going to leave that to one side. We're also not going to engage in speculation on upcoming Legendary Lords in this video. Guys, I've already made a DLC prediction video. If you want to check that out, do check out the top right hand corner now. And that has most of my predictions for the DLC we're looking to get in the game, and the Legendary Lords and races, etc. we might be looking to get further down the line. So we're leaving all of that to the side to focus on where we might move around some Legendary Lords for that perfect blend of lore and fun mechanics that will make an enjoyable campaign of the ones stuck in the same starting position for the Total War Warhammer 1 races. And we're going to start with the race that still only has the one and single starting position, and that is the Empire. So, the Empire, ruled over by Emperor Karl Franz, starts where he probably should do in Altdorf. No problems with that at all. Keep him there as the faction leader, absolutely. Now, unfortunately, it looks like any kind of Midland DLC where you get to play as Boris Todbringer is a long way off if we ever get to see it at all. So we can't afford to hold our breath for that. So in the meantime, that leaves us with two options. That leaves us with Volkmar the Grim to deal with, and with Guilt. Now, these are the only two we can afford to move around for the Empire. We're able to move around for the Empire, and they present us with a couple of problems. Namely, that they are both loyal to the Emperor. Guilt, until he does something silly later in the end times, but we're not going to get into that, pretty loyal to the Emperor, and so is Volkmar the Grim. So it makes sense that he's able to control them. But because we're not going to get that Midland DLC, we have to move them away. So let's explore some of the options about how we can go about that and still make it true to the lore, still make them loyal to the Emperor. So let's start off with Balthazar Guilt.
By the comic.
Now, Guilt is the supreme patriarch of the colleges of magics, meaning that he is the ambassador for all of the different colleges within the empire itself, the true representation of magic within the human empire. So we're going to use a symbol for all the colleges to kind of represent where Guilt could maybe go on this map. Now, in terms of Guilt's lore, he started his days in Marienburg, and I think this could be a potential starting position for him, except for the fact that Marienburg is already kind of intrinsically tied to so many of the other campaigns around it. For example, if you put Guilt in there, you'd probably have to make it defendable, which would limit the early potential of a Bretonnia or Empire campaign in trying to take Marienburg. It would just kind of complicate a lot of on-edge balances of mechanics to around the beginning of the Empire and Bretonnia campaigns. He was from there and he ran away. He wouldn't necessarily rush back. There's no reason for him to be running it. I think there's a bit more potential with another one of his main story threads in the Warhammer world, and that's looking further north towards Nordland. Now, in one of his more famous tales, Guilt was sent to Nordland to deal with Theodoric, the Elector Count of Nordland. Now, Karl Franz had assigned him to make sure that the Elector Count of Nordland did not go through with his ambition to take over vast swathes of territory from Hochland. Now, the Elector Count of Nordland didn't have really enough troops to do this by himself, but he had managed to amass a huge amount of gold with which he planned to pay a mercenary army. At this point, Guilt, using his metal magic, decided to do what he did best and transmute magic from gold into lead, leaving the vaults of the Elector Count of Nordland completely empty of gold and thoroughly pissing off the guy. So he vowed to take revenge on Guilt, and we could put ourselves in a scenario where Guilt is looking to escape Nordland and maybe end up setting up camp, having just made his escape from the Elector Count of Nordland, who is after his head. So this gives us a couple of options. There's the option of starting Guilt in the smaller town in Nordland, which I think is Dieterschaffen. I'm not 100% sure about that one. It might not be. It might be something else. But the smaller town in Nordland's an option. But actually, what my thinking was that let's take Guilt out of Nordland, allow Nordland to have its maximum strength. It does start with a Beastmen horde right in the middle of it, so why not allow it to get a little bit of a bonus, and move him to Norden. Now, Norden is a city that used to belong to Nordland at some point. I'm not sure when exactly it switched over power to Ostland, or it might just be in different places there's conflicting lore about who's exactly in charge of the town. But the idea that Guilt's holding out in a town that used to belong to the Elector Count, but no longer does, is kind of appealing if you think about it. So I think it would serve to annoy the Elector Count. You could start off Guilt in Norden, the smaller village in Ostland. He could end up fighting against Nordland, start him at war. Then in this position, he also has the Kislev to deal with, Norskans to deal with, also Hellpit not too far away. There's the Dwarves up in the north. There's kind of a lot going on in this general area. Also ending up being Guilt the front line against Chaos in some cases, which might encourage them to go further south and around him rather than take Guilt head on. So I think all in all, this would prove to be a thoroughly interesting campaign if you had Guilt up in Norden. Now, some of you may argue that starting off in the smaller town might be a bit disadvantageous, but the fact that we've seen that Gladden Isabelle can start in a small town, it does start a little bit more built up. It starts at level 3, but I think you could do the same for Guilt. Start him in a built-up town there in Ostland, and I think he'll be able to survive, and he'll survive long enough if you're playing as Karl Franz, for Karl Franz to make contact and to be able to reach some kind of diplomatic confederacy to get Guilt under control if needs be. So it gives you enough time, I think, and it's an absolute possibility in terms of being a self-sufficient AI faction as well. So I think a perfect marriage of lore and mechanics there. So we mentioned in terms of Karl Franz being able to confederate with Guilt there briefly, and I think as an aspect for both Guilt and Volkmar, who we'll discuss in a little bit, Karl Franz should have a huge bonus when you're playing as Karl Franz as far as diplomacy goes, and basically as soon as they see Karl Franz, if Karl Franz want to confederate, they should be happy to go along with it, at least in my thinking. That shouldn't necessarily go the other way with Guilt and Volkmar with Franz, but Franz should definitely be able to very easily confederate with both Guilt and Volkmar in terms of the way they play and the way it would work being the Empire. So I think you need to implement that huge diplomatic bonus for the two of them. But that being said, I think this is a great starting position for Guilt, so we'll add him on the map here, and we'll move across and have a look at Volkmar. So Volkmar is the head of the cult of Sigmar, so we'll use the symbol of Sigmar to represent Volkmar here, and the twin-tailed comet that went over when the chap was born and has now become Sigmar's sigil. So we'll use that to place him on the map. Now, in terms of the lore, Volkmar has two real great bastions in terms of the faith of Sigmar. The first, of course, being Altdorf, where he's based already, and the second one is really Nuln. Now, Nuln is devoted to Sigmar so much because they had Magnus the Pious, who was a reunifier of the Empire after many centuries of civil strife. And he brought them all together and ended up having his capital in Nuln, built a huge cathedral of Sigmar there, where Volkmar, the Grand Theogonist, and his two archlectors are known to hang out from time to time. So that's an absolute possibility. However, there are problems with that, in that I think being based at Nuln is too similar to being based at Altdorf. I don't think it brings enough variety, isn't far enough away. So let's go elsewhere perhaps for our inspiration on where to put Volkmar. Now, Volkmar came as part of the DLC pack that really focused on a supplement book known as The Blood of Sigmar. Now, this looked at the conflict between Volkmar and Manfred von Carstein. In the book, Manfred had very dramatically announced himself having returned to Sylvania by throwing a dead corpse through the glass ceiling of a meeting of the Elector Count where Volkmar was present, and that just said, look, I abdicate from the Empire, I am taking control of Sylvania. Karl Franz was like, no thank you very much, and sent Volkmar off to deal with the situation. Now, where he sent him to was actually Talabecland, where he asked him to muster forces to go and deal with Manfred. Now, I think Talabecland works actually pretty well as a starting base for Volkmar. He gets access to the Knights of the Blazing Sun, which was a unit that came with his DLC, nicely fitting in there, and they fought alongside him against Manfred von Carstein, and it allows him to march south into the lands of the Vampire Counts. Now, where this campaign might have some trouble is early on. There's not really a very obvious early conflict for Volkmar to have, because there's not really a vampire faction right next to him. That could be dealt with. I think what would be quite fun is the introduction of something not dissimilar to the Bretonia mechanic, where undead armies keep popping up near Talabecland until Volkmar takes out his first Vampire Count settlement. I think that would play very nicely into the theme of the Blood of Sigmar pack that he was meant to be a part of. And I think that would solve the early on problem of him not really having anyone to fight until he makes his way down to Sylvania to deal with the vampires firsthand. Now, there is another option of moving him up north. He has known to fight Norska an awful lot. In fact, just before this, he had just come back from a campaign fighting the Norskan tribes. But I think in this position, he actually has the opportunity to do both. Norska probably will come that far south, give him some trouble, and he can fight them and fight the Vampire Counts as well, kind of in the perfect position to do both. The only flaw about this particular location is the early conflicts, I feel, but I think that can be solved. But I like thematically it fits in, more probably tilting the balance towards the lore appeal rather than necessarily the mechanics, but I think it's very doable, and I like the idea of Volkmar starting in Talabecland, so he can strike out at Manfred von Carstein. So while we're on the topic of vampires, why not get to them? So unlike the Empire, the Vampire Counts have a lot of legendary lords who actually have no ties at all to Castle Drakenhof, which is where most of them have to start. Now, we also have Gladden Isabelle, and I think we need to address their starting positions. It's a bit silly having them right next to Castle Drakenhof, but you know what? Their mechanics and their campaign has been worked on, and it is a separate starting position, so I don't think we're going to see any changes to Vlad and Isabelle's position. It's a bit weird, but we're going to have to set that aside for now, and let's just focus on the one stuck in Castle Drakenhof. Of course, the faction is led by Manfred, and Manfred is exactly where he needs to be. No arguments there. The only thing I'd say is that maybe with Manfred, you could chuck in the whole mechanic of the Books of Nagash that we saw for the Tomb Kings in Total War Warhammer 2. That would be a great addition to his Mortal Empires campaign and all of these Vampire Count characters. But he's fine, so let's move on to one that I think is absolutely clear: Heinrich Kamla. So we're going to give Heinrich a symbol just for some Vampire Count rebels that we've seen that kind of looks the same as the top of his staff. Now, in terms of Heinrich's lore, he lives mostly in the Grey Mountains between Bretonnia and the Empire. However, an argument could be made for placing Heinrich up in Norsca here, and that's due to his discovery of his trusted manservant Krell. Now, Krell was a Chaos Warrior back in the day, brought back to life by Nagash, and then supposedly sort of rediscovered by Heinrich, with some help maybe from Nagash, arguably. They found Krell. With a deal he did with the Chaos Gods, they brought Krell back to life, and now Krell and Heinrich kind of go around rampaging the world together. The idea being that he had to go up here because Krell, I believe, was buried in the Glacial Lake, or near the Glacial Lake is where he eventually died. Now, in the lore, it's written a bit funnily that he's wandering around the vaults and he finds Krell, but they're kind of two separate sentences. It's all a bit confusing, but I don't see why Krell would have been buried down by the vaults. So there is an argument to be made, I think, for placing Heinrich up in Norsca, and it'd be very interesting to have an undead faction up in Norsca, because there's no reason they shouldn't be there. One could argue the cold slows down zombies, but I'm not sure that's ever really been established in Warhammer lore, just World War Z lore. So, that's a possibility. However, I think a better fit for Heinrich is he went up, got Krell, put him in his actual home territories of the Grey Mountains here in the middle. Now, this is a much better fit for Heinrich and Krell because this is what they do. They go around, they harangue Britannia, they harangue the Wood Elves. This is what they're known for in the lore. And it gives us a very interesting sort of options for where exactly they'll place. Now, ideally, I'd probably like to see them placed where Skarsnik is, but Skarsnik's taking up that spot, and you don't really want to move Skarsnik because his campaign works pretty well. Now, the only option I had if I was redoing the map that I could do, I'd maybe move Skarsnik to an area known as Massive Orcal, which is a mountain range in the middle of Bretonnia, not too far away from where he currently is, but it just shifts him slightly westward, and he could be there, and then Krell could be where he is, or not Krell, Heinrich even, could be where he is. Now, this isn't really going to be a possibility. We're looking at the easiest solutions here that CA might possibly implement. So we're looking really probably further north from Skarsnik or further south down in the vaults by Belegar and his starting position. Now, the issue is a lot's going on already down south by Belegar. There's Greenskins down there. There's now Skaven down there. There's Tilia. It might be a bit too much for Belegar to also take on Heinrich in the Undead. This position would also severely limit Heinrich's ability to get at Bretonnia. He'd have to go through the woods of Athel Loren to even start haranguing Bretonnia, and really in the lore he's managed to attack both. He'd have to either go do that or go the other way around through Estalia, past Skavenblight, past Tilia, and that's not really exactly the way he should be playing. So that leaves us the other option of looking further north. Now, the way the mountain ranges are done by Creative Assembly, some exit some ways and other ways, and I think if you go further north to Carrick Asgaraz, where there's currently a dwarven city, a sort of main size colony, I think that's a perfect position for Heinrich in the current situation we have with the Mortal Empires campaign, and it faces towards Bretonnia rather than the Empire side of things. So placing him right there at Carrick Asgaraz allows him to get out, attack Bretonnia. It's not too far away from the Wood Elves if he wants to cause them hassle. Now, looking at the map, you might think think it's a little bit too close to Skarsnik. But the way the mountainside is done, for Heinrich, because he doesn't have any kind of underground burrowing ability as an undead player, he can't get to Skarsnik, and so for him, he'd have to go all the way around and go past Helmgart, get past a couple of Bretonnian towns. It's not really that close in terms of the amount of effort it will take to get to Skarsnik, but they might encounter each other in early encounters if you're against the AI, if you're playing as Heinrich, which is okay, I think. Now, I think this is the perfect thing that allows him to attack Bretonnia. If you want, you can attack the Empire. You get Skarsnik right next to you. Orion and Durfu aren't too far away. This is where Heinrich should really be. Also, it gives you the opportunity to do some deals with Musior. Sometimes it can be a bit tricky to get the Red Duke playing in your army to confederate with him as the other vampire counts because they're so far away. Heinrich would allow you to get another unique general under your belt because you're right next to Musior. You can start up a friendship relatively early. You can ally yourselves against some of the stronger Bretonnian factions and the Wood Elves. So that actually works out rather nicely, and I think mechanically and lore-wise, this position would be an absolutely fantastic balance for Heinrich to play in, and would just add a lot of extra interesting elements to both the Bretonnian campaigns and, to be fair, the Empire campaigns as well. You don't have to fight your way across the entire Empire or wait for the vampire counts to conquer half of the Empire before you get there, before you encounter some serious undead factions. So I think really kind of a perfect marriage, both lore-wise and mechanically, to put Heinrich there, and for me really just a complete no-brainer. You might also have to make the mountain ranges suitable climates for Heinrich. Actually, I think all mountain ranges should be suitable climate for the undead. I don't see why there's a problem with them. I mean, they are the undead after all. But you might have to make an exception for him if you're just going to change one of the legendary lords so he can colonize those mountains as well as the plains below. But I think that's the only kind of tweak you'd have to give to Heinrich. So hopefully we see him placed there. That would be great to see. So moving on from Heinrich, we have Helman Gorst.
My puppet starts.
So for Helman Gorst, to mark his position on the map, he doesn't really have any known symbols, so we're just going to use Waldenhofs. Now, Helman Gorst is not a character of renown, shall we say. He was invented for a supplement book that we've spoken about a little bit in this video, known as the Blood of Sigmar, which is the predominant part of his DLC. He was set up in the DLC as a rival to Volkmar, but he isn't really. Volkmar was really going after Manfred, and Gorst was really dealt with mostly this kind of witch hunter named Corden. They're kind of on even par. They were just both heroes, really, in the general's armies. Now, Gorst himself was a guy who lost his brothers, went a bit nuts, and ended up trying to learn magic to resurrect them. He was eventually sort of picked up talent, and Manfred took him under his wing, and he helped Manfred fight Volkmar's intrusion into Sylvania. Now, because he's a relatively new and unknown character, there's not a huge amount of lore around him. What we do know is that he comes from Tempelhof, so that's a possibility as far as places we could place him. However, if you see that, it gets a bit crowded there, and I think for both the von Karstein campaign and the Manfred one, you kind of need Tempelhof to take over early on, and putting him there would just make it a bit busy and would kind of defeat the whole point of spreading out the legendary lords in the first place. So if we're not going to put him in Tempelhof, what are our other options? Now, he has a couple of bits of lore here and there, but I'm going to pull on the tiniest bit of string to kind of explain where else we can probably put him, and that's the fact that when he was growing up as a boy, he used to like to travel far and wide, as far as he was allowed to go within Tempelhof, sending messages, like transferring papers and stuff as his job as a courier, or whatever it was, and he thoroughly enjoyed this. Now that he's a bit of a lackey of Manfred, one could assume that he'd be happy to volunteer for any kind of messaging job or far-off errands that Manfred might have, which opens up a lot of possibilities, really kind of allowing him to go anywhere in the map. So by looking at the map, there are a couple of places I considered, but there was one place in the map that I think is scandalously underused at this point, and will fill up later on if we ever get a kind of Dogs of War army or a colonial army in Total War Warhammer 2, and that is the Border Princes. Now, trying to be careful that we don't get in the way of any future Dogs of War armies or anything like that, it's worth bearing in mind that most of the mercenary named generals tend to hail from Tilia, so they'll probably be in Tilia, and they'll probably have one of their legendary lords over near where Mazdamundi starts, and I think those will be starting positions for the legendary lords. They'll probably have one, but I think if we leave Akendorf available for another Dogs of War army general, then I think we're fine by putting Helmengorst in Myrmidons. Now, I think this is absolutely fine place for him. I think mechanically it's definitely a mechanics over lore position. It allows him to have some exchanges with the Savage Orcs. There's Beastmen potentially threatening him. There's Skaven Blight. There's Tilia. There's Belagar himself. Potentially even the Wood Elves coming over the mountains. I just think it's a very interesting place to be and a very underutilized area of the map in the Mortal Empires campaign. Based out of Myrmidons on the southern peninsula there would be a really fantastic thing. Also exposing him to chaos later on in the Chaos Invasion, allowing him to fight them off from the south. So we have a spot for Helmengorst, and let's move on now to one I want to talk about quickly, which is the Beastmen. So this is just a quick one that I actually can't believe hasn't been done already. Now, it takes a bit of a history lesson to understand what went on here. The Beastmen was the first race pack DLC to be released, and with the Legendary Lords they released, there was Kazarak and there was the Dark Omen. Now, they moved Kazarak over to Estalia and the Dark Omen into the Badlands because simply they were just kind of quiet areas that they thought you'd get some good gameplay mechanics out of it. No real lore linking either character there. In fact, there was a mini campaign where you were able to play as Kazarak fighting his arch nemesis Boris Todbringer, who's the Elector Count of Middenland. So really he should be up there. And then what happened was that later on we got the Wood Elves released. Now, when the Wood Elves were released, the issue was that it also came with the Wood Elf nemesis, Morgor Shadowgrave. Now, Morgor is an arch-nemesis of the Wood Elves, and in the Wood Elf campaign, he's the one who faces them, and he comes up from the south, from Estalia. Now, what Mortal Empires suffers from is a leftover from the Grand Campaign, in that Morgor over here should be down south where Kazarak is, and Kazarak should be up north where Morgor is. Morgor starts in Nordland, which is madness, and Kazarak starts down in Estalia. Now, Morgor should be where he can get at the Wood Elves, and Kazarak should be where he can get at Boris Todbringer. So you need to just swap those two around, put Morgor in the south, and put Kazarak in the north, and that's it. They wouldn't make a huge difference. You just need to change them around, and you're all set. So, that's about it for the Beastmen. Moving on from them, simple swap is all they needed. Let's go on to the Dwarves. So the Dwarves are pretty simple. We have a few characters who have homes, we know where they belong, but it's been a bit twisted around. So, we have Thorgrim at Karazakarak, where he belongs, but we can move on to one we know who needs a shift, and that is Ungrim Ironfist, the Slayer King, who we know is from Karakadrin, so we will give him the flag of Karakadrin as his symbol, and we know where he needs to go. Absolutely, go home to Karakadrin, Ungrim. It's a great place mechanically. You'd be fighting the undead, you could fight the Empire, there are greenskins in the mountains, Skaven could perhaps come down from Hell Pit. It's a great position for him to be in, and one that would be fun to play from as well. So no problems with moving him there. I think that's a fairly simple solution. So there we go, Ungrim Ironfist back home, Karakadrin. So next up we have Grombrindal, the White Dwarf. Now Grombrindal is a dwarf of myth and legend, and is said to pop up wherever the dwarves need help, so it makes sense to maybe move him away from the capital, but he could go anywhere. Could end up at Karak-Zorn, the Spine of Sotek. You could put him at Zufbar if you wanted to. But for me, I don't want to sort of say that we're going to put him in Karak-Zorn or the Spine of Sotek, because for me those are really Total War Warhammer 2 locations, and I think if they do what I think they will do, Creative Assembly at some point will introduce new Legendary Lords for Total War Warhammer 1 in Total War Warhammer 2 as kind of race packs for people who don't own the first game, but I think that's a while off yet. But I think that's what they will do eventually, and those will potentially be starting positions for Dwarven Legendary Lords that they introduce. Now, looking separately from that, that leaves us with Zufbar, but I think Zufbar is, again, a bit too busy. There's no need to have Grombrindal kill off Manfred or Vlad or Isabella that early in the game, so I think Zufbar isn't perhaps the best position for him. So where does that leave us? And I think when considering that, we have to remember that Grombrindal is in fact Snorri Whitebeard, an ancient high king of the Dwarves. In fact, he was king of the Dwarves where they were nearly at the peak of their power, at least since the initial invasion of chaos into the Warhammer world. So he knew where a lot of these so-called lost colonies were. He has a lot of hidden knowledge, so it doesn't limit him to existing within the known cities of Dwarvendom as it exists today. Saying that, I think he should go up north, because Snorri had an adventure up north. He knows there's settlements up there that need help, so Grombrindal turning up north would be a fantastic place for him to start with those northern dwarves up there. So I think that's a great location. He'd be fighting off Norska. He'd have maybe some early encounters with Frog, but I don't think he'd necessarily have the army ability to wipe out Frog's colony early on. It might take him a little while. So, you know, they could have a number of ongoing battles. Chaos would come in, there's Hell Pit right up there, he'd have to fight the Skaven, so I think that's a great position for Grombrindal to really turn up. You wouldn't have to do much, just plonk him up there and he'd be fine, like hope he survives. It'd be a pretty hard campaign, because also right at the beginning of the Chaos invasion, see if Grombrindal can hold him off single-handedly. Snorri Whitebeard also had a great friendship with Malekith, which was later on betrayed, and maybe explains why Snorri came back from the grave. So it really allows you access to the sea, so Snorri can get across that sea and really take down Malekith in Naggarond a little bit easier. So it makes that trek across to Naggarond a little bit easier, unlike if you started at Karak, it would maybe take you fighting across multiple allies and enemy territories. Here you just have to go across Kislev, and then you can get to the sea and make your way across to Malekith to settle perhaps the grudge of all grudges. So I think that's a perfect position for Grombrindal up there. I think it would work out mechanically, and would really like to see him based in that location. Also makes him potentially viable for Total War Warhammer 3 territory, where we expect Kislev to be introduced, and so would actually maybe still put him in that map territory as well. But that's about it. It would be great to see Grombrindal up there, leading the Northern Dwarves, allowing them to survive in times of dire trouble, much like the White Dwarf was meant to do. So moving on, let's go to the Greenskins. Now the Greenskins is going to be a weird one for me, guys. I'm really torn about this, I'll be honest with you. The issue is that with the Greenskins, Creative Assembly had really started to get their legs in terms of varied Legendary Lord starting locations. They'd moved Wurzag over to Ekrond, and they had Skarsnik up in the Grey Mountains trying to get back to Karak 8 Peaks, which really only left Grimgor and Azag the Slaughterer in Black Crag. Now, neither of those legendary lords are from Black Crag. Now, the only reason they're down there is that the Badlands and this area is known for having a lot of orcs. And I think mechanically they just thought, you know what, we'll just throw them in there, that's where orcs are from, we'll throw the legendary lord orcs in this area where there's a gold mine, they'll be able to grow quite quickly, and that's how they designed the game. The issue is that if you were going to start moving legendary lords around, you could technically argue for both of them moving. The actual sort of legendary lord stroke character in charge of Black Crag is a guy by the name of Gorfang, who has a whole rivalry going on with the king of Karak Azul, which is the nearby dwarven kingdom. Now, that would be a great thing that I hope we one day see played out in Total War Warhammer, but so far isn't in the game. So I can't see them completely abandoning Black Crag, so somebody has to get left behind. So let's just tackle it one at a time, shall we then, and sort of do the pros and cons of both options. The first one is, of course, Gor Ironhide. Now, Gor in the lore is actually based in the north, near what is known on the map as Karak Ungor, but known to the Greenskins as Red Eye Mountain. Now, this seems like a great position. Karak Ungor has a gold mine, so you could support a Greenskin economy as well as you probably could in Black Crag. You could have him marching out, raiding in the Empire. There are dwarves in the mountains as well. It's not too far away away from Ungrim if we were to put him back at Karak Kadrin. He'd be fighting the Skaven from Hellpit. Chaos would come down, he could fight them as well. He could fight to his heart's content, and it also puts him in a perfect position for the map going westward in Total War Warhammer 3, or northwestward even. So he'd be in a perfect position for both, and I just think it's a great position for him to be in, and I would love to play a Greenskin campaign starting out of that area for something different. Also, when Kislev's introduced, it will give him a chance to fight Kislev head to head. It'll just be a great place to fight as Grimgor, and I think mechanically and lore-wise, it would just be perfect. Almost as good as Heinrich's little setup. So I think we'd love to see Grimgor there. So really on the downside, nothing really, except that would they really move the faction leader, and that seems unlikely. So let's take a look at what the option would be if they didn't move Grimgor and instead decided to move Azag the Slaughterer. So Azag himself is another orc from the north. He's actually from Troll Country in Kislev, and that's where he ended up finding the Crown of Sorcery, the old Crown of Nagash. Now there's the mountain range up in the southern bit of Troll Country, which is I think where he comes from. I'm not 100% sure on that. It might be further north. But he put together the tribes there and went on a rampage around the Northern Empire. So he eventually got defeated in the Northern Empire, and the Empire reclaimed the Crown of Sorcery, which would mean that you'd have to end up putting Azag, or not have to, but perhaps consider end up putting Azag somewhere around the Northern Empire where he presumably escaped death or was resurrected or something along those lines. And the only option for that really is Brass Keep up in Northern Hockland, which in the lore is actually a chaos-controlled fort, I believe, rather than one controlled by the Empire itself. So you could just flip that over a little bit and make Azag take it over. I think that would work pretty well. Now the problem with being based out of Brass Keep would be that he wouldn't really have a lot of options in terms of where to go, how to grow his empire. He could charge into the empire itself, of course, and maybe you just give Azag that kind of climate to be good in, so he can just take over parts of the empire, and that would be an okay way to go as far as the Greenskins are concerned. So, you know, it could play out that way, and I think Azag would be an okay campaign there. If we moved it the way we've been discussing on the map, you'd have Kazarak to the west, you'd have Guilt north of you, and you had Volkmar the Grim to the south. It would make that area a little bit busy, but, you know, fun having a greenskin presence bang in the middle of the Empire. So for me, it's really a toss-up. I could go for Grimgor, I could go for Azag being up north. It would be kind of, I mean, I think Grimgor's would be the better, more interesting campaign, but Azag being up there would be fun as well. The thing is, you couldn't do both, and at this point, until you introduce Gorfang Rockgut and put him in Blackcrag, you're gonna keep one of them behind. Now, for me, it's a toss-up, so I'm not gonna make a call on this one, unfortunately, guys. Perhaps cowardly of me, but whichever way they go, it's okay. And you know what? If they keep them both in the Badlands for now, in my book, that's actually okay as well. Because for the Greenskins, technically now, there's several different starting positions anyway. I think, actually, perhaps the most spoiled for choice of the Old World races. Yes, indeed, already the most spoiled for choice of the Old World races. So they might not touch the Greenskins at all. So I'm going to call it a wash. And then let's move on to the final note I want to make on this. And that is Chaos, ruled over, of course, by Archeon the Ever-Chosen. Now, for Chaos, guys, we're going to keep it pretty simple. I'm pretty happy with where Archeon and Kolek start. They should be marching into the Empire, so their starting position is okay. I think there is some flexibility if you just wanted to change things up a little bit, and I feel it's going to be a while until we get new Chaos Lords. But I think that Sigvald the Magnificent has potential to be moved. He spent a lot of his time traveling around. In fact, he's one of the few who've actually had a campaign on Ulthuan itself. Now, it didn't work out for him, but at least he gave it a go. He's known to have sort of sailed towards Bretonnia as well, and I think you could move him about. He is obviously dedicated to a single Chaos God as well. So if you're looking when we eventually get Demons of Chaos armies to assign him to something like Slaanesh and maybe allow him to have Demonettes of Slaanesh, you might want to take him out of the General Warrior of Chaos factions and, you know, move him about. So I think you could, at the moment in the Mortal Empires campaign, move him to the north under the banner of Slaanesh, perhaps, and just move him over there for future reference. But if you want to keep him in the Chaos one, that's actually fine as well. It's just if you want a different starting position for Chaos, Sigvald's the guy to start it off with, I think. And by putting him in the sort of western continent in the north, it allows him to maybe team up with the Dark Elves, maybe fulfill my headcanon of having him hook up with Marathi and do all kinds of devious and horrific things to one another before marching on the High Elves yet again. It's just one of the sort of lore threads that you could pull on to allow you to give Chaos a different starting position as an excuse without introducing new Chaos legendary lords at this stage. So that's about it for my thinking, guys, on the Mortal Empire campaign starting positions. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you think CA are actually going to give us different starting positions in this new May update? But as I said, guys, let me know what you think. As always, a huge thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you all on the next one. Alright, guys, thanks. Bye.